Okay. Hello, everyone. Rabbi Mizrahi here, continuing our explorations in Jewish philosophy. I want to just share the screen with you. All right, very good. Um, we're going to do a quick review of what we did last week because this week's class actually is a continuation of last week's class. If you missed it, here is basically a brief summary of what we discussed last week. We began with this notion of Torah Misinai. That is what it is called. Torah Misinai means that this is, let me see if I can move this. Um, Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. This is the first Mishnah, the first phrase of the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, which is the teachings, the principles of our ancestors, the rabbis of the Mishnaic times. This was Torah-based advice for good living. It begins with Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai, that Moses received the Torah from God at Mount Sinai. Now, up until about 150 years ago, this statement was unchallenged by anyone, Christian, Muslim, or Jew, that there was a revelation at Sinai. Moses went up to the mountain and received the Torah and uh, uh, presented it to the Jewish people at the foot of Mount Sinai. Um, why can't I move my screen? Ew. Now, there we go. Okay. In fact, we say this every time we hoist the Torah in the above our heads. After we read from the Torah, we open it up wide, so everyone can see the contents inside. And we say, "V'zot Torah." This is the Torah, Asher Sam Moshe, which Moshe placed Lifnei Bnei Yisrael, before the Jewish people, Api Hashem Bi'ad Moshe, from the mouth of God through the hand of Moses. This is an axiomatic belief of the Jewish people. The Torah that we have in our hands today is the same Torah, the same content that was presented to Moses by Moses to the Jewish people 3,337 years ago. In 1878, a scientific analysis of the Torah was conducted by Julius Wellhausen, who published a paper basically saying that the Torah did not come from Sinai, Moses did not write it, but rather that it was written by several different independent authors. Each one wrote a fragment, didn't know about the other one, and at some point, an unknown redactor stitched them all together to create the Torah that we have today, and sold it to the Jewish people, that this was actually the law of Moses from Mount Sinai. This created a tidal wave of impact in the world of biblical studies, and the fallout from the Wellhausen theory basically was that a Christian theology independent of the Old Testament could be created. The Old Testament, of course, speaks about the Jews. But the problem with the Old Testament for Christians is that the single most important event in history for a Christian is the birth, ministry, and death of Jesus, and nothing in the Old Testament refers to that. So there had been a thrust amongst some strains of Protestant thought to create a theology of Christianity that did not rely on the Old Testament, and in this by discrediting the Old Testament as a source, it opened the door for a Christian theology that did not rely on the Old Testament. In this new Christian theology, Jesus is not a Jew. He's actually an enemy of the Jews. He's an enemy of the Pharisees, and he is the proto-Christian, and he is not Jewish at all. He actually fought against the rabbis. The second thing it does is it was a stunning refutation of Jewish exceptionalism. The Jews were no longer the chosen people, which is a problematic concept for the church. because the church claimed that it was the new Israel and the new chosen people. It was also a door to Christian triumphalism. As to quote Spinoza, that Christianity was a noble and worthy heir to the prophetic Judaism that the rabbis had spoiled with all their stupid laws. It destroyed the veracity of the Torah as history. No longer could the five books of Moses be considered historically accurate, and every statement about time and place and incident and event had to be independently verified. Most importantly, it undermined the authority of biblical law, meaning that if a bunch of dead white men had written these laws about keeping kosher, about keeping Shabbat, about wearing tzitzit, about putting on tefillin, if we don't like the laws, then we can just abolish them. They had no authority other than a bunch of really clever old white guys. It reduced the text to mere narrative, which is extremely important for the Christians, because they had to concede that the four Gospels are not history. They are merely narrative, campfire stories that got embellished over the years until they were finally written down. So if their primary books are not considered historically accurate, then it should be appropriate that the Jewish books should also be in the level of narrative and not have any more authority than that. And lastly, from a Jewish perspective, the Wellhausen theory was adopted by the Reform because it broke the yoke of Mosaic law on the Jews. As far as they were concerned, we no longer had to observe these laws. They were lovely suggestions, and if you feel motivated to keep them, great. But if you don't feel motivated, also okay. And that is the position of the Reform movement to this day. The fact of the matter is that there was a very, very strong and concerted effort to push back against the Wellhausen theory. It's also called higher criticism. And as Rabbi Schechter properly pointed out, higher criticism was merely a form of anti-Semitism by attacking the Jewish source text and our deed to the land of Israel. It was an attack against Jews themselves. We also talked about Rabbi Dr. Hertz, who was the chief rabbi of the British Empire, who published in the late 1930s his very, very famous edition of the Five Books of Moses and the Haftorahs, specifically bringing commentary to dispute and disprove the Wellhausen theory. He did it by resolving contradictions in the narrative that, according to Wellhausen, was proof of different hands writing the story. He resolved those. He brought many arguments about the historical integrity of the text. Unlike the New Testament, where Jesus is perfect, or the Quran, where Muhammad is perfect, the Jewish leaders that are mentioned in the Pentateuch, particularly Moses, have feet of clay, make a lot of mistakes. Importantly, he brought a lot of linguistic and archaeological proofs based on the latest scientific investigations, linguistic evidence that places Leviticus in 1400 BCE, not at the time of the Mishnah, as Wellhausen suggested, and archaeological proofs that buttress the historical claims of the Torah, particularly at that time they were exploring the Egyptian tombs and the sarcophagi, etc. We also talked about structural proofs, which call the lie to the Wellhausen theory. If you take a look at just one example of many, many, there is a chiastic structure to the narrative. According to Wellhausen, the duplication of the story is because the redactor melded together two disparate accounts of the flood. But if you actually take a look at the structure of the text itself, it shows very, very high level ordering, and that kind of ordering could only have been done by a single pen and not more than one. We also brought logical proofs to demonstrate that the Torah was, in fact, written by one pen. After 3,337 years, there are no variants of the Pentateuch of the Chumash. We don't have variants. We don't have the fragments that Wellhausen claims that we should have found. None of those exist. There are no Jewish communities in even the remotest part of the world have a Sefer Torah that is at variance with the Torah that we have. This is in contrast to the Gospels and to the Quran, where there are many, many variants and many different versions. So we brought all this as proof that of the single authorship of the Torah. So today, now that we've pretty much discredited the Wellhausen theory, in fact, even scientific investigators, biblical archaeologists, no longer consider the Wellhausen theory viable. However, people still talk about it as if it is still the latest, greatest thing that we have in understanding the biblical text, particularly in the Reform movement of Judaism. They love them some Wellhausen. But serious scholars have already conceded, for many reasons, that it is no longer valid. So now that we have a single authorship, we're left with the single authorship of these 5 books of Moses. The question is, who wrote it? And the reality is, if you think about it, there's really only 2 possibilities. One possibility is that what tradition teaches is that Moses went up to the mountain and that he sat there for 40 days and 40 nights, and he wrote down, he transcribed from the mouth of God these words to be written on these parchments. The other possibility is that Moses himself wrote this book. He was a super smart guy. He didn't get any guidance from God, or maybe he got some divine inspiration, but essentially this is his work, the creation of his mind. There really are no other options. Ezra lived 1,500 years later, and as we said, the linguistic evidence places this text in around the year 1400 before the Common Era, not 1,000 years later or more when Ezra lived. So let's take a look at what the possibilities are on each side of the argument here. Let's look at the arguments for Moses having written this book. And the first argument is that he was raised in Pharaoh's house, which means he had access to the greatest libraries in the world. He was obviously extraordinarily bright, and he had exposure to the greatest texts that existed in that time. Second thing was that he was aware of surrounding cultures. Egypt, Memphis was, if you'll forgive the term, the world's Mecca. Egypt was the reigning power. And we know that at time Canaan was a vassal state of Egypt. Many other of the surrounding cultures and city-states were as well. They all came and flooded into Egypt to pay tribute, and there was a tremendous cross-current of cultures and ideas, to which no doubt Moses was exposed to, which would give him more grounding and background in creating this amazing book. And the third reason is that it feels right. It's a reasonable hypothesis to say that this was written by man. We postmoderns and people even in the age of reason, it makes more sense and it's more cuddly to say that it was written by a human being than to have to rely on a mystical explanation and rely on miracles and all kinds of supernatural hocus pocus to suggest that this book came from God to Moses. That requires a leap of faith, which makes rational people uncomfortable. So it's easier to say that, well, Moses wrote the book. He was super smart. Let's take a look now at some of the arguments that mitigate against Moses writing this book. Let's remember that if those who claim that Moses wrote this book have to say that Moses was a liar, because repeatedly throughout this book, he says he received it from God. So if this book was in fact written by Moses and Moses alone, then he is trying to peddle a lie to the Jewish people. Now, that's a fascinating thesis, that he really perpetrated a lie in telling the Jews that this came from God, not from me. So the first argument that we have against this theory is the rebellion of Korah. which is listed in the book of Numbers, chapters 16 through chapters 18. Many of you may know this story. Korach was Moses' first cousin. He was wealthy and he was good looking, and he thought that he should be the leader. And he actually wanted to remove Moses from power. And one of the reasons that he wanted to do that was that his claim was Hakol mida'ato, that everything that Moses had given us in this book came from his own mind. It did not come from God. When he went up to the mountain, God gave him nothing. And when he went into the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, to commune with God, God told him nothing. He came out and said, "Thus saith the Lord," and he peddled this lie that it actually came from God. And in order to prove this, Korach, the Midrash states in the Sifrei, I believe that he asked him this question. He said, "Hey Moses, you gave us this mitzvah of tzitzit, of the blue thread and the 7 white threads. But let me ask you a question." He said, "If there's a garment that is made 100% of this special blue wool, does it need another blue string to make it kosher to wear?" And Moses said, "That's what God told me." And Korach said, "Well, that just proves that you're lying, because it's illogical that if it has 10,000 threads of blue, it can't possibly be true that God would say it needs another a strand of blue in order to be kosher to wear." And then he also brought another attack against Moses, said, "Hey, Moses," he said, "if you gave us this law that we have to put this little scroll on our doorpost." He said, "If you have a house that's full of Torah scrolls, does that house need a little teeny tiny mezuzah to make it kosher to live in?" And Moses said, "That is the halacha. That's what God told me." And again, Korach made fun of him in public and dressed him down and said, "It can't possibly be that a house full of hundreds of Torahs needs one little teeny tiny scroll in order to make it suitable to live in." In the end, as we know, Korach met a very grisly end. So did his followers. It was a very, very, very serious rebellion against Moses. 250 of the most prominent leaders of the Israelites joined in Korach's rebellion. And it had not been for God's intervention, Moses would have been deposed as the leader of the Jewish people. But hold on a minute. If Moses was trying to perpetuate a lie to the Jewish people, that he received this book from God, the last thing a liar wants is to call attention to the fact that he's lying. So if Moses was if Moses was truly the author of this book, he would have never included this history of Korach's rebellion, because it casts a limelight on exactly the thesis that he didn't want anybody to think about. Maybe you wrote it yourself, Moses. Maybe you didn't get it from God. And yet we see that in the story of Korach, Moses faithfully writes down this incident, even though it brings up this idea that Moses wrote the book himself. So we see that the rebellion of Korach is a strong refutation for the thesis that Moses wrote it. Because if he had written it himself and he'd not got it from God, he would never have mentioned this incident. Another argument against Moses having written this book. We have the incident of the Benot Salafchad. You may know of this incident, you may remember it in your studies, but the daughters of a man named Salafchad, and this is the quote. So the daughters of Salafchad of the tribe of Manasseh, he was the son of Hefer, the son of Gilad, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. They carry this man's genealogy right back to Jacob's son Joseph. These daughters came forward. Their names were Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. The Torah mentions them in the most respectful and laudatory terms, and it mentions their names more than once because God was very, very pleased with their argument. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the chieftains, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and they said as follows: "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not one of Korach's faction, which banded together against Hashem, but he died for his own sins, and he left no sons. So the law of inheritance was that the property of a father goes to his sons and not to his daughters, because his daughters would be married to somebody else and they would be provided for. In the Torah construct, women were a protected class. They did not need to have the inheritance. By contrast, the sons, who would have to support their own families, needed father's inheritance in order to support their own families. They were the providers, women were the receivers of that provision. But in this case, the ancestral heritage that would have been allotted to Tzlafchad in the land of Israel would wind up devolving on his brothers or someone else. They felt that was wrong. And they felt that in the case that no son emerged to inherit a father's estate, then the estate should be divided amongst the daughters. It's a very logical argument. They stood up in front of the entire assembly, in front of Moses. And what does it say? The last line says, Moses brought their case before God. Rashi comments on that last verse. Rashi says, he brought the case before Hashem because the law on this subject escaped him. Now, hold on a minute. Moses wrote this book, supposedly. If he wrote it, he would have known the law. And yet, the law on this matter, how to adjudicate this problem, escaped him, and he had to go back into the tent of meeting to present the case before God. And it is adjudicated in their favor, by the way. That's not part of our argument here. But how could Moses have not known the law if he himself wrote these books? So there's a very strong refutation against the notion that Moses wrote these books himself. Could say maybe he just forgot. That would be unlikely of a person of the stature of Moses. He spent 40 years in the desert teaching and reteaching and teaching and reteaching these laws to the Jewish people. It's inconceivable that he could not have known the law, particularly if he had written it himself. Next argument against the authorship of the Torah being Moses alone and not through any assistance from God is the incident of Mei Merivah. These are the waters of strife. Many of us are familiar with this story that Miriam dies and the Jewish people no longer have a source of water, and they start freaking out and complaining. This is in the 40th year that they were in the desert. God commands Moses and Aaron to produce water from the rock. Moses, for whatever reason, and there's a lot to say on this whole incident, which we won't get into here, he strikes the rock. When he strikes the rock and the water gushes out, he is severely, severely reprimanded by God. And he is embarrassed in front of the people, and he is told because of his transgression, he will not be allowed to enter the land of Israel and lead the Jews into the land of Israel. Now, that would have been the crowning achievement of his 40-year ministry to the Jewish people. That's all he wanted. He wanted, he could have gone in as a private citizen. He wanted to enter the land of Israel with the Jewish people. And because of this minor infraction, he is told, he is not allowed to enter the land of Israel and would die in the wilderness. Now, again, if Moses wrote this book, why on earth would he have included that incident where he is dressed down by God and where the most important goal in his life, to lead the Jewish people into the land of Israel, is denied him? He could have eliminated it completely. He could have spared himself the humiliation, and the book could have simply said that he died in the desert. But the fact that this is in here mitigates very strongly against the fact that Moses himself and alone wrote this book. Next, let's talk about Moses' bitterness and complaints. The book of Deuteronomy is actually, in the main, Moses' last will and testament. Over the last 36 days of his life, he says over the book of Deuteronomy, which God included in the Torah, and he complains both against God and against the Jewish people. This is the Parsha of Ve'echanan, and I pleaded with Hashem at that time, saying, I won't read the whole thing, but essentially what he says is, I went to bat for these people who have gotten you angry 10 different times. Their faith is weak, and every single time they mess up and I prayed on their behalf, you granted them atonement. And now they are about to enter the land. I make one teeny tiny mistake, and I am not allowed to enter the land of Israel. What justice is there in that? These complaints, again, if Moses alone was the author of this book, why would he write of himself in such a disparaging way, to be so full of bitterness and complaints and contempt for being denied what he felt was his rightful reward for all of the self-sacrifice that he had engaged in over these last 40 years to bring the Jews to the edge of the land of Israel. So again, we see that this is inconsistent with the notion that Moses himself wrote this book. The other thing we have to say is that we said at the beginning, we have to concede if Moses wrote this book, then he is a liar. But he's not only just a liar, he's not peddling a fraud to the Jewish people, but he's a really very, very bad liar. And to make the next argument, I want to take a step back for a second, and I want to take a look at lies. And there's two different kinds of lies. There's smart lies, and there's stupid lies. I don't know if you've ever given this any thought, but smart lies are lies that are very difficult to disprove. For example, well, I was out in the woods and a UFO picked me up and they examined me and dropped me back in the woods. Well, that is a very smart lie. Well, maybe it happened, but if it's a very smart lie, why? Because it's impossible to disprove it. It happened to one person. There's no evidence. It's a lie that people might believe. And if they do believe it, it would be very difficult to refute. By the way, as an aside, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon religion, he had an encounter with Jesus in a cave in upstate New York. No witnesses. Smart lie. Muhammad had his encounter in the desert with Allah. No witnesses. Smart lie. Jesus went out to the desert in those 13 years that are accounted for in his life. And he was told, we're led to believe that he was the Messiah, the Redeemer of the Jewish people. But there were no witnesses in that encounter with the divine. Moses also has a smart encounter with the divine, which, if it is a lie, it's a very smart lie. Because it says, I descended to the mountain to receive the tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant that Hashem made with you, and I stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights, eating no bread and drinking no water. That's a smart lie, because it's impossible to disprove. He was up there alone. But then he says something else, which he would not have said if he was trying to peddle the lie. He says, the exact words that Hashem had addressed to you on the mountain out of the fire on the day of the great assembly. That was the day that we received the 10 commandments, Shavuot. There were 3 million witnesses there. This was not a revelation that was only given to an individual. It was a revelation before 3 million people. And Moses is saying, yeah, I went up by myself and you didn't see that, but you did see the giving of the revelation at Sinai. So I'm not lying here. What's an example of a stupid lie? So a stupid lie, as you see from the quote, not everything you read on the internet is true, signed Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, this quotation is a lie. Abraham Lincoln never said that. Why is it a stupid lie? It's a stupid lie because it can be easily disproven. It can be easily disproven. We all understand Abraham Lincoln didn't have the benefit of electricity, let alone the internet. And so we read this and we chuckle, but this is an example of a stupid lie. Here's an example of a stupid lie in the Torah. Again, well, let's talk it through. It says, any other animal that has true hoofs, which are cleft in two, and brings up its cud, such you may eat. But then the Torah goes on to list 4 different animals. that have one sign and not the other. One is to have split hooves, one is to bring up the cud. So there are three animals that chew their cud, but that do not have cleft hooves. Who are they? The camel, the hare, and the rabbit. So although they bring up the cud, they have no true hooves. They are impure for you, the Torah says. Also the swine, the pig, for it has the other sign. It has the split hooves, but it does not chew its cud. So here's the issue. I don't know if you can see where I'm going with this. Moses is trying to perpetuate a fraud that God gave him this book and he didn't write it on his own. Now, if he had stopped at the first sentence, any animal that doesn't have a cleft hoof and chew its cud is kosher, that would have been a very smart lie to say that that came from God. But then he goes on to identify four specific animals that have one sign, don't have the other. Now, if anybody in the fullness of human history from that time on ever discovers another species that fits one of those two categories, it proves that Moses is a liar. Because why would he write that? I mean, it just opens him up. It exposes him to being called a liar. Hey, I found another animal that's not on your list. And this list is exhaustive, as it turns out. I mean, Moses didn't know about Australia. Moses didn't know about India. Moses didn't know about North America. How could he possibly have written this if he could not be 100% sure that he would not be discredited or disproved in the future? As it happens, we have never found another animal that meets one of these two categories. So it's a very strong argument. It's a stupid lie to have put that in there. He should have stopped with the general rule: split hooves, chew cud, kosher. Instead, he includes these specific examples that expose him to being a fraud should any other animal come along that meets one of these two criteria. So this again is a proof. It's a stupid lie if he was going to lie, and it doesn't make sense. He could have given us the kosher laws without including it. It suggests that only the author of life could have said, this is the exhaustive list of animals that chew their cud but don't have a split hoof, and those who have a split hoof and don't chew their cud. So there we are. So I'll give you another example of a stupid lie that's to be found in the Torah, that if Moses alone had written this book, he would never, ever, ever have put this in here. We know about the laws of the sabbatical year, Shemitah in Hebrew, and the way it works is every seventh year, the land has to lay fallow. Now, you might say to yourself, rational man, that is a good law. We call that crop rotation. It allows the soil to replenish itself of vitamins and nutrients so it can continue to grow good crops. We know what happened in the Dust Bowl in the 1930s in the United States. They did not rotate their crops, and the land became depleted of nutrients and nothing would grow. But here's the thing. If human beings were going to establish a sabbatical year, what we would say probably is, hey, let's divide the land up into, say, sevenths or 12ths. Let's do the sabbatical year every 12 years, one for each tribe. And we'll stagger the sabbaticals so that one group lets their land lay fallow, and the others will continue to produce so that nobody goes hungry. But that's not what the Torah says. The Torah says that everybody, without exception, has to put their plows and their tractors away for the same year. Everybody at once, which is hard enough to believe. But then it goes on to say, and what happened? What are we going to eat in the seventh year if we can't sow seeds or gather them in our crops? God, unless it's Moses, says, I will ordain my blessing for you in the sixth year, so that it shall yield a crop sufficient for 3 years. The text is doubling down and saying, not only will you stop everybody at once, non-negotiable, but I will provide a bumper crop in the sixth year that you have enough for the seventh, and you have enough for the first year of the new cycle until crops start coming in and you have something to eat. Stop and think about that law. and God promises that nobody will die. If you're Moses, would you have structured the sabbatical year that way? All it takes is a single person to die from starvation in the sabbatical year, and people would throw that book in the garbage can. We would have done it by staggering the sabbaticals, but we don't do that. Also, interestingly, we don't stagger the Sabbath day. We don't say one group takes off on Saturday, one group takes off on Sunday. We all have the same Sabbath day. We all rest as a people. So this again is an interesting proof that Moses, if he is a liar, he is a very, very poor liar. Because he shouldn't have included the names of those animals that, if disproven, would mark this book as a fraud. And he certainly should not have created and constructed the laws of Shemitah so that everybody has to rest at once. The 6th year is a promise of bumper crops and that nobody would die from allowing the land to lay fallow. There's many, many, many more proofs like this from inside the Torah text. But I hope that that these arguments taken in whole really make it quite unlikely that Moses alone, without the instructions from God, could have written this remarkable text. I want to give you one other proof. Maybe you'll say to me, Rabbi, maybe Moses included all this stuff to throw suspicion away from him. No, so people would say in subsequent years, Moses couldn't have written this book because of look at all this crazy stuff in it. No human would have written it. But I want to share something with you. We've talked about the Bible codes. We talked about that in our first lesson. This is a Bible code that is in Parshat Akev in the book of Deuteronomy. And in this Parsha, it's a 12-letter skip. I'm not going to go into the methodology of the Bible codes right now, but it does mention the Shoah here. It mentions a Hitler here, Adolf Hitler. It mentions Auschwitz here, 1942, from 1941. And it also mentions Af v'chema yaku, anger and flurry will smite us. And that God is the judge, the God is the King of Kings and the Judge of Judges. And lo v'arabchem lo takshu, and that our necks we should not stiffen. So these codes that we find in the Torah, as I mentioned before, that's been written up in mathematical journals. These codes occur at something like 7 standard deviations away from random. There's no way that this could have been just random. There's many, many Bible codes in the Torah. This is one of the most chilling, that the Holocaust was actually predicted by the Torah text. Now, I don't care how smart you think Moses is, or that he was educated in Pharaoh's palace and had access to all the libraries of the world, that he received a very, very broad, pluralistic cultural education. There's no way that Moses, looking forward 4,000 years, could have predicted Adolf Hitler and the destruction of European Jewry with such specificity in this text. I'd like to suggest that it leaves us where we started, with the traditional presumption that it is God himself who dictated this remarkable book to Moses, which we have in our hands without variation for the last 3,337 years. It's a book that is still very worthy of our study. We study it every Shabbat morning and twice or 3 times a week during the week. And we continue, even after 3,300 years, to find new insights and new lessons that are for our times in this remarkable book. So if I haven't persuaded you, that's okay. We can still continue this dialogue, but I personally find these arguments quite persuasive. It is one of the reasons that I became a rabbi, actually, because I wanted to be able to study the Torah full time and learn its depths and understand its deeper meanings and its secrets. So that is our class this afternoon. I thank you. I know that many of you weren't able to come because of Thanksgiving, but it is being recorded, and you'll be able to view it after at your own leisure. Please feel free to hit me up with questions, comments, observations. This is Rabbi Mizrahi from B'nai Israel Synagogue in Pensacola, Florida, signing off, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving break.